Anybody who doesn't want to move and walk up the stairs can stay downstairs. We have a very broad and general topic for this afternoon's panel. I want to briefly introduce the panelists and give a brief introduction of my background. I am Officer General of the Staff. I might be the oldest in the Austrian Armed Forces. Something maybe to be proud of. I spent most of my service in Brussels, in the European Defence Agency, and with the NATO services during the past years. And between that, I spent 1 year as a commander in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and worked with the European Defence Cooperation. Apart from that, I did a lot in my own private time. I was a president of the Austrian Comradeship in Upper Austria for more than 10 years, and I'm director of the Austrian Peace Academy and vice president of the Institute for Southeast European Studies in Tirana, and I'm an initiator of the popular initiative for general universal conscription for male and female citizens in Austria. I would like to welcome Alexander Dubovi. He is a recognized expert on Ukraine and on Eastern Europe. He works as senior researcher here at the National Defence Academy. He teaches in very high quality, as I may say, and I want to ask him to add a few remarks on current topics to his remarks and his presentation. He will be talking on the strategic reorganization and the crisis of international organization. He will be the last to present his views. The next panelist I would like to introduce is Dr. Walter Posch. He is an expert on Middle and Far East and on Iran. He teaches conflict transformation here at the Academy, and he will be focusing on the strategic importance of cooperating with local players. The third panelist I'm happy to announce is Tim Rohart from Berlin. His presentation will concentrate on strategic problem solving in international organizations. He is a teacher and counsellor of the German Federal Parliament. Nicholas Stockhammer is the fourth panelist this afternoon. His presentation will focus on grand strategy and the link to the United States and to geostrategy. He's a senior researcher and political scientist. He has published his views in the second edition of the Austrian Military Journal just recently. So let me start with my own presentation briefly. Having introduced the panelists, we will concentrate on the aspect of alliances in international cooperation, with a special focus on NATO and the European Union and their cooperation. Apart from that, I would like to present a practical example for unsuccessful conflict resolution in the West Balkans. I would also like to give you some definitions for the terms we will be using and a brief summary of changes at EU level. NATO, as we know, is not a military alliance. It is an organization that was founded for security among 29 original members. They work according to these joint values and rules. The values fixed in 1949 for NATO are listed here. All decisions are taken by consensus, no matter how small or big the member country is. NATO is active in a military sense. We know that from Bosnia-Herzegovina or from the Kosovo crisis. It contributed decisively to ending the murder and atrocities in Kosovo. General Norman presented details on that in the Austrian Military General and at the conference. The Balkans are a focus region for NATO, the EU, and many other international players. They follow special goals. All instruments and tools of international policy, including the Austrian presidency in the Council of the European Union. The European Union, on the other hand, is a political organization. It has 28 members who work together on the basis of a set of values and goals. They are mainly identical to the values of NATO, which shows that it makes good sense for the two organizations to cooperate. NATO has a military branch, which covers one aspect of its task. The European Union covers another field of security policy. I will be going into more detail on this later. The European Union strives to establish a society based on tolerance, the rule of law, solidarity, non-discrimination and inclusion, based on the free movement of services, individuals, capital and goods. We can see that the European Union has many objectives still to reach. Keeping to these values and goals, NATO and EU member states and staff and the members of the commissions can work together. And you can recognize certain common elements in their goals and values. The Austrian Federal President, Van der Bellen, on 23rd of June, gave some important comments on values of the European Union. He said that we all, every single one of us, have to think about what kind of Europe we wish to live in. Within both organizations, EU and NATO, there are no criteria of convergence regarding these values. There are in financial and economic terms, but not in terms of the values and goals these two organizations follow. So there is no monitoring and no evaluation in this area. The next organization I'd like to address is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It has close cooperation with the EU and among its countries for many years. In 2016, the first joint declaration was adopted, and now on the 15th of July, the second joint declaration will be adopted regarding NATO-EU cooperation. Will focus on the Western Balkans, the Black Sea, the hybrid cyber defense. So many of the topics are covered which we talk about at this conference. You can see a brief summary of the population and surface of the NATO and EU member countries, which allow you to compare the two organizations. The European Union has an important tool called the European External Action Service. It was founded in order to implement the external policy objectives and goals. It is present in all member countries, has about 120 EU delegations in 3 international organizations and third countries. They have a staff of about 4,000 staff members, and this is the 4th largest diplomatic service in the world. It also interacts and has relations with the G7 and the United Nations. At least 2 or 3 representatives of the European Union work together with the EEAS. The European Union, as we know, covers all important political areas the goals are coordinated with the member states. The problems here are permanent time pressure, great inventiveness on the part of the players, and a certain degree of stubbornness on the part of the European Union and its members. There are so many different topics that it sometimes gets difficult to get an overview of what is to be done. The Council of the European Union, European Council, has an important role to play here. It discusses issues in the European Union in different formats based on suggestions and legislative proposals by the Commission. And every country, as you know, has 6 months of chairmanship in this council. The joint foreign and security policy, as you know, is one of the main topics of discussion here. The central function of the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy is at the same time Vice President of the Commission and head of the European Defence Agency. And she, in this case it's a woman, Federica Mogherini, is also foreign policy decision-making head of the European Union. But there is no Council of Defence Ministers and no permanent Commission for Security and Defence. But the defence ministers and foreign ministers meet back-to-back on an informal basis twice a year. The countries around the European Union and the contact with them is the subject of the European Commissioner for Neighbourhood Policy. European neighbourhood policy has increased in importance, and since this year we've already had a strategy for the Western Balkans adopted by the EU. The point of having European neighbourhood policy in the first place is forming a ring of stable friendly states around the EU, both on the side of the Eastern Partnership, on a partnership, and in other North African countries, for example. Just a short time ago, France and Germany said that we should develop our defense policy in Europe, develop a joint defense and strategic culture of European Union member states. This week, the joint military initiative goals were presented in Luxembourg, and 8 member states are going to take part in it. Now, what can we learn from history? This is the Eastern Partnership and the Mediterranean Union, the Union for the Mediterranean region. There is a lot we can learn from history. It would have saved the EU a lot of trouble, especially in the Balkan region, because the Balkan is always in the media, and it's full of political statements, which are often conflicting. We should look at the London Conference of Ambassadors in 1912, after the First Balkan War, with its results and intentions, but we should also look at the players' interests. Sir Edward Grey was the chairman. His main objective was to ensure peace and stability in Europe. The diplomatic goal was to create a balance and to maintain a balance of the superpowers without focusing on the fate of the people actually living in the region. This was why, for example, mainly Albanian settlements in Serbia were made part of Albania. Austria managed to succeed in having Albania reaching the foundation of the Albanian state in its today's form. And this altogether laid the foundations for today's difficult situation and the tensions in the Balkans. Even though it was said that all countries and peoples would have sovereignty, We still have a problem because we didn't listen to history back there. If we want to have solutions, we need to look to the Balkans, we need to understand the history, and if the first statements for individual Balkan states are being prepared in a written form, it is important to look at past statements, and all this fits in perfectly with the views I have just presented. EU has hundreds of institutions. More than 100 initiatives, maybe even thousands, are implemented on a parallel basis. And the member states still have more different ideas on what should be done. We're all familiar with Professor Schlüchter and his presentations held today and yesterday. And at the first conference here at the Academy, he presented important points on this, on the self-image of Europeans and conflicting self-images and exterior images. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once said that you need clear terms and concepts in order to be able to give orders. I think this is an important thing, and he was absolutely right. Goethe was right. Less could be more in this context. Using clear terms and defining them clearly, terms like Europe, European, Western Europe, or European neighborhood, European autonomy, space strategy, all these different terms are just name-dropping, and they do not yet define what exactly people are trying to talk about, even if it's European Union members and Commission members. Strategy and strategic are not clearly defined terms either. It is important to keep defining these terms more clearly. For 50 years, the European Union and the member states have contributed importantly to peace in the region. And some of these successful developments are a result of strategic considerations. But right now, EU citizens see their organization in a permanent state of emergency. If the EU intends to be a global player, we should overcome nationalist tendencies. The French president once, only a short time ago, French President Macron said it is the kind of leprosy of today. Nationalism is the leprosy of today. So we should actually accept everybody in our society. This may be challenging, but I think diversity is the only possible way forward. So less could be more. This is a lesson we have to learn as fast as possible. We should also aim for the establishment of a Council of Defense Ministers and a Permanent Council for Defense and Strategy. This would be a chance to foster peace in the Balkan region and reconcile Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, finally. And lastly, first, the topic of the European Union as such would have to reach citizens, the people in the street, in Europe too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Nicholas Stockhammer, as previously mentioned. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Colonel, for your introduction. I would like to touch on what you said before. When we want to talk about strategy, we need clear definitions, and the underlying dilemma that we've seen here, particularly in the conference, is that we don't really have clarity about what strategy really means, how to define strategy. Military officers have their own idea of what strategy is, as well as politicians. It's even worse when we talk about grand strategy. I have a selection of American standard works on this issue, on grand strategy. Here we have John Lewis Gaddis' most recent book. And there is no unity of definition here. For that reason, I tried to pick out some of the key definitions so that you have an idea of what a grand strategy is supposed to be. Of course, the translation into German is rather ambivalent as well, ambiguous. There's about a great strategy. But Herr Nückes actually talks about something more toward a comprehensive strategy. An overarching strategy would be what he was aiming for. What is a grand strategy? Well, here you have the original definition from Sir Basil Willhart. He was talking about a higher level of wartime strategy. That means that the policymakers have all the resources at their disposal. They can coordinate these as well. These are military, economic, and diplomatic resources and other sources in order to work toward a political goal in any given war. Of course, war is the key component. And here you have the definition according to Fuller. He said that the grand strategy was the national fabric upon which the war picture is woven. And this entails directing all warlike resources toward the winning of the war. Again, allow me to point out, this is aimed at winning a war. Colin Gray, this is a very famous strategist, strategic thinker, is also someone on this side. He believes that all instruments of power available to the security community should be purposely employed. Peter Pfeiffer. This is a quote that I liked in particular. The grand strategy is the art of reconciling ends and means. Halbrands. This is the book that I had on my slide just a minute ago. He said it is a conceptual framework that helps nations determine where they want to go and how they ought to get there. And, of course, we have Joachim Krause. I don't want to keep that from you. This is a German political scientist. He says this is the orientation for foreign and security policy of a country. I'm not going to read the rest of it for you. And here, it's about seeking options for action in terms of policy and strategy and military action. So from Power, Tower, Peace and War, this was from Walter Russell Mead. I think he recognized the root of the root definition of grand strategy. And here he quotes Clausewitz saying that it's about winning battles. And when we talk about tactics with strategies, we're talking about campaigns and wars. But grand strategy, this is about deciding what wars are to be fought, what wars are to be waged. Tactics is for generals and officers. Strategies was for the headquarters, and grand strategy was for ministers and kings. So what is the difference between grand strategy? How does grand strategy differentiate itself from the regular strategy? We were talking about the military means. Of course, here we have diplomatic, financial, economic, and IT resources. We're not talking about external powers and forces. We're talking about internal powers and forces. And this is exactly what Colonel Rozenits was talking about. Also, what we heard this morning, we have to mobilize the forces you have in the population. And this is not just about the wartime situation, we're talking about peacetime as well. So we mustn't forget that the grand strategy is actually embedded here in a framework. Here you can see this depicted in the form of a pyramid. And this is a quote from the movie Lincoln. That grand strategy can be a compass that will point you true north. This is something that Brigadier Peischel likes to point out, but of course if you're traveling true north, this will not help you if you sink down in a swamp. So what's the use of knowing true north? So grand strategy can only help you in terms of strategy and tactics and other components if it is all tied together. So my definition, here I tried to sum this up very briefly. A grand strategy is a substrate of the primacy of a policy that is poured into the mold of a doctrine. So it's a coherent long-term plan for ordering national objectives and devising realistic methods to achieve them. There are three well-known stages of grand strategy. Usually it begins with a threat assessment, then comes the strategic adjustment, then you have resource extraction and resource mobilization. So the process for designing a grand strategy is something that I have also stolen from Geddes. Here, this is a net evaluation. What are we evaluating in a net way? Not just the resources we have in our environment, but we have all of the knowns. This is information on geography, topography, climate, our own abilities, capabilities, and the objectives that you are trying to achieve. The unknown knowns, these are the probabilities, these are the goals of the opponent, how reliable our allies are, the constraints of cultures, the capabilities of our own country, and the capability of a country to withstand difficulties. This is resilience. And the unknown unknowns, we have to respectfully acknowledge these as well. This is a current depiction of the U.S.'s grand strategy. Depicted as a table, you have present dangers, U.S. foreign policy, governance, and U.S. economic policy. Here you can see the very complex interlinkages between all of these subjects and issues. It's very important here to look at this from a comprehensive point of view. So when I'm talking about the grand strategy, and if I want to use the grand strategy employed properly, I have to look at the elements of power, and I have to employ these resources properly. You have the IEMP model, according to Michael Mann. Here you have ideological, economic, military, and political power. And you see here the interplay amongst all of these. Walter Russell, Mead, tried to come up with a comprehensive idea. He came up with the idea of hegemonic power against the backdrop of grand strategy, and this also incorporates sharp power. This is the military power, and you have sticky power, which is economic power, and sweet power. This is the soft power. These are values and culture. What does this mean? So when I try to break this down according to Joseph Nye, sticky power and sharp power can come under the heading of hard power, and sweet power and hegemonic power come under soft power. And this is my conclusion from all of this information, is that grand strategic thinking actually should be situated under the heading of soft power, because you have the primacy of our policy making when we're talking about strategic thinking and the development of grand strategies. Here, all of this is toward a result. You have military strategy, political, economic strategy. Of course, these are also highlighted to a great extent, and all of these play together, or flow together, and make up a grand strategy toward a single result. What is most important? Well, what is the goal? What is the objective? What is our strategy developed and designed for? Particularly with regards to a grand strategy. For a very long time, it was assumed that a strategy should be aimed at an objective, particularly with conflicts. This is what Carl Schmitt said when we're talking about traditional and conventional conflicts in the world. But Herfried Mücker is talking about wars in the future, conflicts in the future. We'll talk about controlling streams, regulating flows of capital, people, and information. This is what modern grand strategies will likely be focused on in the future. And I would like to touch on the United States very briefly. There are two main traditions for grand strategy in the United States, liberalism, and this goes hand in hand with multilateralism. This is something that is promoted primarily by the Democrats and Democratic presidents. So you have the conservatism or even neoconservatism, which goes hand in hand with unilateralism. This is something that Republicans have traditionally advocated. But I have to say that I have found excellent examples of both of these types of grand strategies in the respectively other camp. So what is the essence of these strategic traditions in the United States? You have the Hamiltonians, who were followers of Alexander Hamilton, and then you have, on the other side, the Wilsonians, whose goal is the universal democratization and the exploitation of democracy. You have the Jeffersonians, who are the quintessence of conservatism. Here, this is about conserving the integrity of values of the American Revolution and focusing on domestic policies. And then you have the Jacksonians. These are those that promote resolute security policy. There, it would be permitted to resort to violence very quickly in order to pursue political strategic goals. So, one excellent example here, one of the great strategists of the United States was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Here, he was the president during the Second World War. His motto was to rearm because we wanted to support our allies and we wanted to create prosperity. So the hope was not to have to go to war again, but there was no desire to promise not to go to war. And there was the certainty that the Soviet Union would survive. And the idea was for it to be a continental ally. We knew that large portions of World War II would be fought by the Red Army and not by American forces. And thirdly, and this is an analogy to Clausewitz, the moral apex of attack. You need a trigger in order to silence your domestic policy opponents. And this is exactly what happened in 1941 in Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war just a few days later. So, here you can see what my conclusion is. Here you have Donald Trump. There are many observers who say that Trump has no strategy of his own, and certainly not a grand strategy. But in contemporary literature, there are many people who disagree with that statement, because there's always been a grand strategy. And presidents have either availed themselves of this strategy to a greater extent or to a lesser extent. But you also have to look at emerging strategy. This is something that we draw on Henry Winsberg for. So you have an emerging grand strategy, and this emergent factor, of course, is something that we see to a large extent with Donald Trump. I would see Donald Trump as a proponent of the Jacksonian approach, who is an advocate of hard skills, hard policy in the United States itself. He sees geopolitics as a zero-sum game. We have seen this. He wants, of course, to be on the winning side. And so his goal is to conclude deals in order to achieve an added value, in order to be on the winning side in a zero-sum game. It's also very important to point out that policy making and politics is for Trump a friend-foe scheme. There's only winners and losers. And make America great again is his motto. This means making sure that America and Trump himself are on the winning side. His main pillars are protectionism, marginalism, continentalism, and unilateralism. Here, I have borrowed many of these ideas from Halbrand. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Tim Bochart to take the floor. I'd like to introduce myself. I work at the University for Economics and Global Studies in Berlin. I am responsible primarily for more theoretic approaches. For many years, I worked for a political group in the Bundesrat, mainly focusing on a wide range of political issues. And this also included the TTIP as well as our trade agreement with Canada. The TTIP, of course, which has yet to come about. So our responsibility to protect is very important because our representatives in the Bundesrat have to vote on the deployment of the German army abroad. This is very important in Germany. Also, we've tried to harmonize policy, particularly on the basis of these norms. So the idea is it is a responsibility to help people in need. And we are a country that has come to this conclusion. Unfortunately, we have moved away somewhat from these ideas. And in terms of security policy, we are focusing more on our own country. This is something that we talked about last year. When I spoke last year, I finished my presentation with a call toward more of a strategic orientation, focusing more on international organizations, not just on national categories, and not necessarily focusing on national identity and national security. It would be greater opportunity in finding a solution within the context of international organizations and focusing on the result. Particularly when we know how complex these issues are. Particularly with regard to the idea that this disorder is very complex and we want to achieve a goal. It's very difficult to work individually toward this goal, but many of us have shared goals. For example, there's a representative from Albania. There's the goal of the European Union to enlarge there. So the idea that we belong together and we could lower the costs of national security. So this is a shared goal, and this is something that we've also pointed out as well. This is perhaps a very small-scale policy or a small-scale objective that may be seen that way, particularly within the harmonization of policy shaping. This would be very important in the idea of consolidation. So maybe this is a marginal question, a very detailed question, but this is something that Mr. Rozenits talked about subsidiarity in the European Union, and this is important within the context of international organizations because people do not care to look at details, they look at an overarching framework. And the details are then hammered out on a national level. So the idea is to focus on other international organizations, such as environmental organizations, and these details can be hammered out on other levels. This is also very important against the backdrop of cyber. Here we're looking at an increased complexity there. This is not a problem we can tackle within the framework of national security. This is a problem that we can only tackle if we all work together. It's a problem that we all face here. Here I would like to talk about hybrid resilience and cyber, for example, and narratives. Last year, I pointed out studies for international relations, and I would like to touch on that very briefly within the context of international organizations. So this has a great deal of order, rules, and rigid membership. And this is something that is regulated through speaking acts. This is very important. We are facing existential threat, and we need to regulate this. There are geopolitical arguments. For example, we are allies with the United States. For that reason, we need international treaties, and we have the individual layers there. And this is an opportunity that would have been regulated in this way. We have a hybrid aspect. You have a subsidiarity where the various regulatory levels are mixed together. This is something that we all face. I also see this in the context of systems theory. We have to look at where We need to be functional, where we are looking at reaching a particular goal, to get again functioning. And we can look at this in the context of working together with NGOs. There are many mobilizing actors. There's, of course, limited attention to be paid. Many people now who have resorted to YouTube trying to generate awareness. And there are many other entities that are trying to generate public attention for their issues. So the NGOs are the ones that are often involved in providing security aspects, and they comment on various issues that people are unprotected and they are going hungry for that reason. We see a disorder entering the equation there. So we've seen that this disorder has been recognized, so we need to include all of the actors in the interplay. We talked about the fact that Trump has an emergent strategy, or is pursuing an emergent strategy. You have the unknown Trump tomorrow, so every day we're confronted with a new kind of Trump, and we don't know what's going to come next. So the question is really, do we want a purposeful, a functional strategy that we want to pursue, or what exactly are we aiming at? So we have a strategy, we have the means and the resources at our disposal, the money's there. For example, we have to decide what we're doing and what direction we're headed in. So the question is, do we have a goal? The European Union, for example, are we aiming at enlarging the European Union, and why? What are the regulations that we need in order to achieve that? Do we want an acquis, for example, that is very detailed in terms of economic policy with the Republic of Moldova or Turkey, or do we want to make sure that the country in question meets the standards of the European Human Rights Convention? Do we want to achieve compliance there in order to found a pan-Europe? So this would be a core European constitution that could be implemented, and then to move out from there. I don't know exactly. I tried to incorporate some of the thoughts that I had generated based on the presentations that I tried to include with these words. Policy is the continuation of what we have them meets. The blame game, for example, the credit game, this is something that I saw as the employees here. We know that we are the ones who kind of case what states make of it. I'm not sure exactly who I'm quoting there, but I may be wrong. So anarchy is with us, is here. It's not just because we can carry out a reality, but it's there so we can shape it. And this is our task and responsibility in order to create a functional body. So we saw that this has a number of various members and arms. So we have to develop a strategy. We have to bring those back to a single point. And this is very clear, particularly with regard to the amount of data, volume of data that we have and that we are able to process, so that we have everything at our fingertips and presence. And Trump, of course, can carry this policy lives in the next for 24 hours, or for 24 hours later we have a new policy. We have to have enough information at our fingertips. We don't need to wait 4 days for the information to arrive from San Francisco and to check the data that's there. We have to be able to react in the moment. We have to react to a strategic moment in a strategic way. We can only do this if we have a strategy. We can have a strategy. We have a clear idea of what purpose and what objective we're pursuing.
Our next speaker is Mr. Posch.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Gentlemen, good afternoon. The topic I would like to focus on this afternoon is part of some research work we have done on armies and militias. One of my colleagues is familiar with some of these research topics. major regional powers and superpowers are currently cooperating or just having contact with smaller regional strategic partners. Is this of strategic importance and strategically useful if, for example, the US cooperate with PKK, Kurds? For me, it's a simple subdivision into tactics and strategy. The rest I leave to philosophers and all other scientific fields. I would like to start with some case studies from Iraq and from Syria, because we do not have any definite political narratives there. We are free to do research and to publish without having to take into account any cliches. This is no longer the case in other conflicts or in other regions, because if you quote one organization or the other, you are expected to immediately add that it is a terrorist organization. But that's something I am not interested in as a researcher. I just look at the facts. So right now, we're looking at Syria. Double cooperation or double loyalty is something that's very important for me here. If there is a major country, they can come in and say, we support one group. We go into military cooperation and provide military support with one group, because they are not mercenaries, but still they have a double loyalty. You bind yourself to them, you tie yourself up with them in some way. I would like to use specific examples at the level of small regional developments to illustrate this point. Let me give you 3 case examples from Syria. We all know a lot about Syria by now. I won't go into the details, but the Syrian civil war has mainly been absorbed by the regime by now. There is still one fundamental element in this conflict, and that is that many state institutions such as intelligence services are still used to mainly keep an eye on the population. They would have another task originally, but that's what they actually do. For example, Air Force intelligence services even lead troops into land combat. So structures are changing here. They are going beyond their original purpose. So if I look at the Syrian example only, it is quite clear that we can say that the regime is in a process of erosion. It is redefining its limits and purposes. So highly decorated Air Force officers actually do different jobs from what they usually were trained for. The political intelligence service is another example for this development, and this goes for the whole of the Middle East, not just for Syria. So we have a high number of irregular players, militias in the battlefield, not just regular armies, and it's very difficult to draw clear lines between them. Now, what are the international foreign actors players in Syria? Russia has different players. Wagner, for example, is a separate contractor. It's a private contractor that works for Russia in the military sphere. Secondly, what also makes a difference is that the Russians and the Iranians are there by invitation of the local government, the national government there. This makes a huge difference. And Iran, the US, Turkey also cooperate with problematic players, because some of these players or organizations are on one or the other international terror organization list, on wanted list, so to say. Now, what are the problems in Syria? They go back to imperial times, Kurds in Iraq, fighting insurgencies in Doha. All this follows very simple and straight American handbooks of conflict development. The development of intelligence and information structures has been underway since the 1960s. In the 60s and 70s, there was also a great deal of time and effort invested in guerrilla training in South Lebanon. With the Iraqi Shia Muslims, with networks of Ayatollahs, cooperation has also increased. They are not dependent on Iran, they are self-sustained in financial terms. And they are part of the so-called international Shia. And thirdly, Lebanese Hezbollah is a very distinct and separate development. We need to take into account this would go beyond the scope of my presentation here. After the main phase of the war, Iran has managed to rationalize its structures. Some elements were actually physically executed, became actually casualties of a war struggle in terms of ideology and intelligence. Currently we have a special unit called the Quad. They're often called the Quad Forces or the Quad Brigades. Actually they're a task force, but the Quads have a lot of influence at the moment. From 80 to 88, Iran had a relative chaos. On the international sphere, many of the terrorist attacks were only mandated after they had happened. But what Iran does all the time, whenever they want to exert pressure, is they try to stress some kind of ideological or cultural relationship to Iran. The Syrian crisis hit Iran hard, but Iran wasn't unprepared. They had had security cooperation with Iran for decades. Actually, these countries were their mutual only friends, and they included each other in a strategic concept that was mainly show, but this resistance maxim, as it was called, resistance against Western colonialism, mainly by Israel, is a main objective of statehood. Syria, Hezbollah and the Hamas, actually the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, were the main players in this effort. It's important to note, though, that all these groups have very different ideological directions, and only this shared narrative, this joint resistance against Israel, which is quoted again and again, enables them to overcome their differences and lead a joint combat. Iran has very good internal cooperation mechanisms and a coordination mechanism for their foreign operations. One of their demands is, and has always been, that they want smaller groups, smaller combat groups, which must be absolutely reliable and absolutely dedicated to ideology. Even if they accept Shia Muslims, they have to be 100% loyal to their leaders and dedicate their life, if necessary, to the revolutionary leader. They are checked in detail as to whether they can be trusted, and it is important to know your partners and to exchange arguments. So they are known for testing people before they accept them, testing them very strictly. If these forces are actually of high quality in a military sense, and if they work in the underground or whether they work in open combat is not that important. They want to be able to trust people, to trust their cooperation partners, and that's what they look for. This also explains how voluntary forces were able to go to Syria. After an internal debate, the revolutionary leaders said, we are staying in Syria. We are not moving out of the country anymore. What the Syrians needed, and desperately, was not really military counseling, but troops, actual troops that they were looking for. The question was, how can we get more troops and where from? You maybe know that the Najaf and Karbala, so the sacred places in Iraq, have a strong awareness of the importance of these places. There used to be one place where clerics were still welcome in the Arab world, that was part of Damascus, maybe even a spiritual place which since the 1980s had developed into a center of Shia Muslim teaching. And here again we see the typical pattern. First of all, the ideological debate, ideological discourse, and after that, security-based discourse. Strong relationships to Iraq were always part of this discourse, and when the civil war in Iraq flared up, it so happened that due to the situation in Syria, the two civil wars got mixed up. This means that, first of all, Sunni Muslims moved into Syria. Later on, they went on to establish the Islamic State, as we know. And later on, in the second stage, Iraqis followed them, and that's when Iran offered Syria to cooperate. Well, there are people coming from Iraq. Let us take them and use them as part of our brigades, together with the forces in Syria who still sympathize with us. These brigades have a certain name, and it is responsible for protecting the sacred district of Damascus, which, by pure chance I'm sure, is on the way to the airport and constitutes a route of practical importance too. This is still a framework organization of troops. All of the Iranian forces and other forces, part of these troops, are very much and clearly supporters of Khamenei, and that's what the Iranians made sure. They wanted to make sure that everybody who is prepared to fight for General Shia cannot go to Damascus. All voluntary fighters had to undergo basic training, had to undergo a selection process and then further training, and via Beirut and other places they were sent to Damascus. Pakistani and Afghan troops came to join them, and two special units from the revolutionary forces, the 65th Air Force Division, for example. So all of these were not regular soldiers, but highly trained career soldiers, plus voluntary soldiers. That was the combination. The Iranians had full control over the S2 and G2 apparatus in all these troops that they sent into the countries. Of course, there was a major risk of independent action. No, excuse me, there was a very small risk of independent action taken on the part of the militias, and the Asaib and Nujaba are no longer a threat. Only the Nujaba sometimes come to border regions. There are about 4,000 people who move near the border and stage protests. Let's briefly look at Turkey. They have a certain amount of experience in the area, but they always stay in their ethnic that is Turkish, Sunni and Muslim community. This is based on the Balkan Wars. That's called Chetty in Bulgaria and Macedonia. And these troops were channeled through a special organization, including irregular fighters from Western Europe. And these form the key basis of today's Turkish intelligence service. So there is a strong military and security dimension here. After modern Turkey withdrew from the Arab world, these developments were stopped, and the people who had been trained were used in Turkey, also based on experience from the Vietnam War. Turkish, Caucasian and other groups were important contact partners. And again, we see the same pattern I mentioned before. First, you have cultural partnerships and ideological partnerships, which are later on upgraded to a military and defense level. If we look at Erdogan, you have a pan-Ottoman and pan-Sunni cooperation element. He tries to benefit from networks of his party, which also enable him to address the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. In Syria, first of all, the Turkish had to admit that they had failed. So they had to revert to Plan B, dismantling the Rojava, the Democratic Federation of North Syria. They were highly uncoordinated. For example, General Staff did not know what the security services did, but they supported, financed, and established different forces in a kind of chaotic environment, which only developed into a coordinated force in the 1970s. By now, they can be used as a political pressure element, also in connection with the Rojava. Quite differently from Iran, Turkish cooperation partners are fighting among themselves. But Turkey has not reached its major aim until in January this year. As for the US, we know the way they deal with irregular fighters and irregular forces. We know all the handbooks they use here. One of the problems, on the other hand, is the YPG, which is clearly part of the PKK. They participated in the fight against, the US participated in the fight against US, and they succeeded in directing developments in Baghdad. They tried to get the Kurdish groups to reconcile among themselves. They tried to make sure that there should be some part of security in the Kurdish regions, but unfortunately they did not manage to reach this goal. The YPG also tried to coordinate several other groups, especially Arabs and Turkmens. But what does it mean to have a group like the PKK upgraded by US support? It means that you cannot help but get some support from somewhere else for the other groups. So in general, these countries depend on each other. They have a complex network of partnerships and cooperations, and all these cooperation networks have dramatic effects on the self-image of the Iranians themselves. So demobilizing the forces, taking them back to Iran is possible for the Iranian forces. As for the Turkish forces, there is a high degree of control, not in interior management, but in military management there is. So simply withdrawing these forces would be a very costly process. There would be a blowback in Turkey, certainly, but we know that they already have a much more radical organization in the country. And finally, for the US, there is a high degree of direct control, similarly to the Turkish cooperation partners, but the internal processes in the cooperation partners organizations are not controlled by the US at all. The costs are much higher than they seem at first, the cost of withdrawal especially, because so far PKK has not defined the US as one of its enemies. If first massacres by US-supported forces among PKK families happen, this is bound to change, but we know that contamination, biological contamination, such as former US officers who are now part of the YPG elite, this type of contamination is a factor to be reckoned with. But the military value of the YPG unit is so big that this could actually lead to radicalization. Thank you very much. This was the main points. These were the main points I wanted to present in brief. So we have exactly 10 minutes. Thank you very much. I will be staying right here just to save time as well. As on the first day, Professor Correctness already stated, first day, the last speaker is free to say whatever he wants, and I'm the last to speak here today. Let me almost abuse the power of being the last speaker to address a different topic than I originally intended. What I want to do is to present a few perspectives on acting without a strategy by using examples from the eastern Ukraine and the Ukrainian area. And since the strategic level has been commented on by previous speakers, I will concentrate on practical examples and present 2 or 3 very brief views to allow at least some minutes of time for debate. I hope there will be a debate. So, the Ukrainian crisis must be seen in a much broader context of the European security, as Samuel Charov and Timothy Colton from the RAND Corporation clearly stated in their recent publication on the Ukraine crisis. The conflict over Ukraine is not even a negative, not even a zero-sum game, but it's a negative-sum game in which everyone loses. The present crisis in European security has developed out of alienation and the actions and perceptions of all parties involved over the last 25 years. It did not only start with the Russian annexation of Crimea. This was the immediate cause, but it was not the underlying cause. Again, let me quote Charov and Colton from the RAND Corporation. It is important not to blame either party or justify either party, because nobody has clean hands in this conflict. As for the cooperation, as for the development of the Ukraine crisis, I see 3 main problems, which also explain why the crisis broke out in the first place. The first reason and the first problem are the different and mutually exclusive narratives. Narratives being one of the central topics of this conference. The Ukrainian example shows that these narratives have very high importance, and that if there are different mutually exclusive narratives, this can actually lead to terrible developments. The central problem here is that we have different narratives. The Russian view is, the Western view is that the central problem is not the rules, but that Russia breaks them. And the Russians have a different view. They believe that only dominance over the neighboring countries can assure security in the region. After the dismantling of the Soviet Union, Russia as Russia says, wanted to become part of the Western power structures. From the Russian point of view, this was a legitimate aspiration, and the Western powers disregarded these ambitions and refused to allow Russia to participate, to become part of the new structures. Russia takes the view that all the other countries could be integrated in Western structures, and that it will be left on its own, the only one to be shunned by NATO, so far as to say. So this would have this is a very high risk for Russia, as it's seen from the Russian perspective, as you can understand. This is exactly the narrative you can read in the 2016 OSCE report by the panel of eminent persons of the OSCE. There is a third narrative too, but this would maybe be a topic for the debate later on. These mutually exclusive narratives and the different expectations ended up leading to making a joint vision impossible. For more than 20 years, there have been summits, discussion meetings, debates, dialogue panels and forums. But even though Russia and the Western powers thought they were using the same concepts, they talked about completely different things. They failed to understand each other for 25 years. And now we can see what happens if you miscommunicate for 25 years. Alienation. These two halves of the power sphere have drifted further and further apart, which finally led to the Ukrainian crisis. Right now we have the European Union on one hand and NATO on the other hand. This is not the entire truth. The truth, as always, is more complex. The third problem, which is often forgotten, which I believe is one of the reasons why Russia and the Western countries fail to understand each other. So the third reason is that the post-Soviet states, the states in between, Europe in between as it is called, is not given enough consideration. We mustn't forget that the conflict is not just about the divide between the West and Russia. The states in between have mainly been seen as objects of influence in the past 25 years, but they haven't really been seen as independent, sovereign states and subjects of state development. But they do have an independent political will and political objectives. They can see, and sometimes they use or abuse, the different approaches taken by Russia and by Western states. Very often they have financial or pecuniary interests in using this divide. We also need to consider that nation-building processes were often unfinished or just failed in these post-Soviet states. Their societies are deeply divided. Split identities, we may call the phenomenon. This is a very important point as well. Civil societies in these countries are often regarded, from the Western viewpoint, as the solution of problems. But in these countries, this is not the case. The civil society structures there are equally part of the problem. They are divided among themselves. They have split identities. Often they are highly nationalistic, and very often they are rather a part of the problem and not part of the solution. That's what we must always remember when dealing with post-Soviet nations. These are the three main considerations we should take into account here in the debate which I hope we will still have. So just for a very brief summary of my conclusions. First of all, Russian and Western policies towards the post-Soviet space have reached a dead end. That's a fact. Secondly, the sanctions and counter-sanctions are here to stay. They have become part of the new European reality. They will not change. And thirdly, we certainly should not let the call for an elimination of the sanctions become a political mantra. This would not change anything about the political programs. The sanctions are just a visible expression of the elimination process that has taken place. Thirdly, the Russia-NATO military standoff along Russia's western border has become a feature of Europe's strategic landscape. No matter what we think about it, it is here to stay. Let's face it. This is the situation as we face it now. And the NATO summit will certainly focus on this standoff too. In any case, it is not a Cold War in the historical sense. That's maybe the one positive point I can make in this context. If you want to know details on why I am of this conviction, you can ask afterwards if you want to. But critical voices, critical towards Russia, believe that the West has the better solution. But here I can only conclude with one old joke by Radio Yerevan. The colleagues from Eastern Europe will still remember Radio Yerevan. Yerevan answers, what is better? Well, it has already been better. It already was before. But let's not end with a joke. What could be the solution? What could be approaches to solution? In my opinion, we should take an open approach and an honest approach to the underlying reasons for today's conflict. The geo-economic, geocultural, geopolitical structure, as Professor Christian Stadler called it, that emerged after the Cold War was basically built on two pillars, EU and NATO. But I believe that without touching the basic foundations of this post-Cold War European security architecture, there will be no substantial progress. I'm deeply convinced that we have to be prepared to change the basic foundations of our security architecture. And finally, the changes in global strategic architecture have already started to change NATO and EU. We are already in the middle of a systemic crisis, and we have no way of telling what this crisis may lead to. But no matter what we will see in the future, I'm deeply convinced that dialogue is important. We must always keep up the dialogue process between the different players. And I'm convinced that the only European security organization that could provide a useful forum for dialogue is the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Regardless of all the problems that are obviously inherent in OSCE structures, it is obvious that only the OSCE is an organization where all countries and nations involved take an active role. All countries and nations involved in this conflict. So this could be the forum for future European security architecture. Colonel Rozenits, this was my statement. I'm looking forward to the discussion that may follow.
So, I would like to thank you for your presentation. So, I have the option of a very brief discussion at 4 o'clock. I am to present the summary of our discussion at the Simultaneous, and in the meantime, we are to enjoy our coffee break. So, if there's any urgent questions, we could deal with them right now. Otherwise, we can talk about them over coffee. So it's very difficult when you have 4 very different topics, but I have 2 main comments. The first is on your comments on the Middle East. For me, the Middle East is a problem that can run between 1906 and 1922, when the Ottoman Empire was broken up. And then, of course, you have the consequences downstream in Europe with the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire. There was a peace there, of course, and then when the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, and they absolved themselves of responsibility, or actually disappeared from having to assume any responsibility, we could put it rather. And then, secondly, we have a situation in Eastern Europe where there is a complete lack of attractiveness for the Western way of life. They were very interested, actually, in the Western way of life originally, but this is actually, it is actually still attractive for the people in Eastern Europe, and this is something that I am lacking in the dialogue, unfortunately. I think this is very important to make it very clear to Russia that people in Eastern Europe are very attracted by the West. So I agree with you that the OSCE needs to be built up even further, but the OSCE is not an organization that is compulsory under international law, or an organization that can create any binding resolutions under your international law. So you have NATO, that is an instrument with which you can compel other countries. A very brief answer. A brief question, a brief answer. So you're right that the Western societal model, of course, is extremely attractive to the countries in this region, in particular in Russia. But there's one thing we shouldn't forget. There was a discussion between Ms. Merkel and Mr. Putin in 2014 at the apex of the Ukraine crisis. Allow me to remind you of that. And after that telephone call, after that, Ms. Merkel said that Mr. Putin lives in a completely different reality. And Angela Merkel is 100% right. He lives in a completely different reality. But the problem is, from our point of view, the majority of the world lives in Putin's world. Lives in Putin's reality. So unfortunately, this is the problem of the bubble that we live in terms of peace and security. This is ice-cold realpolitik. So when you look at the problem with the European Union, I would define it as such that at the beginning of the migration crisis in 2015, at the latest, it became very clear that the original founding idea of the European Union can no longer be sustained. As the desire that was expressed in 2003 in the European Grand Strategy that the European Union is to be surrounded by a satellite of friendly countries. This is no longer the case. We are surrounded by conflicts, a ring of fire. So you have to say that this has never been implemented. What you pointed out, the Arabs, through the course of 2 generations, have tried to shake off the yoke of the Ottoman Empire. And the fact this is something that happened in the Balfour Declaration. But to bring us down to that very minimalistic point, it would give you the illusion that the West could interfere in order to shape the situation on the ground between Turkey and Iraq and Syria. It's important for the people on the ground to take their fates into their own hands. As it's being very difficult. You have Mosul and Syria. None of this has been implemented. We had a disintegration of an empire that was destroyed. No, but it's not what the Arabs have said. That's not how they understood it. You saw structural relationships. You had artificial borders being created. And you had, according to national interest between the English and the French, so the borders between the Turkish and the Syrian. So were actually fought about between the two of them. They were the ones who fought to draw the borders. Had nothing to do with the West. So the EU was supposed to be a very ambitious project right now. That was its original conception. And now it is going to have to become an exceptionalistic project. So borders will have to play a greater role in order to enjoy what we have. In radiating peace and security in the world, we will have to focus on maintaining peace and security within our own borders. What does that mean specifically? How this will be shaped? This is what we will see in the EU summit right now. And I think that this will lay the foundation for the near future. Allow me to make a few brief comment on ex Pico. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So, as I see the peace process and the Syrian conflict, particularly the peace process in the Middle East, the most important states are Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the United States to a certain degree. So, we have seen a constellation where non-Arab states are making decisions that affect the entire Arab world. And maybe the question arises from that is, what counter reactions do we have to anticipate from that? So right now you have the Syrian stalemate has been brought about by the fact that the Syrian government is too weak. So the main problem is after the colonization that you had stable dictatorships that functioned, and this model is dead. So whether it's a Western dictatorship or whatever kind of dictatorship, it's always the same. It's not because it's Salzburgo or Balkanization or colonization. We're talking about a authoritarian state that the West supported for the reasons of stability. This model is dead. The Russians are being proactive, as are the Iranians, and the Europeans are being very passive or even destructive. We don't really have an answer to this. We are looking into a very deep Islamic hole, where we see our opponent reforming and reshaping itself again and again. And the Americans or the Europeans or the Russians don't have any answer. If you propose something, then it's bad. If you don't propose anything, then that's bad as well. Thank you very much.